Hello, welcome to Your Voice. Your vote is your voice. Voting and Minnesota elections, sponsored by just a slew of wonderful organizations at the University of Minnesota. I am your moderator today, Roshini Rajkumar, and your presenting sponsors are the U of M Morris, the Law School at Minnesota, the College of Liberal Arts at the U of M, Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. We're so glad to have you with us today. We have two fabulous panelists, but you may have some technical questions that will help you stay in touch with what's happening today. So you may be joining us by Zoom. Welcome. If you want to listen by phone, dial the number on your screen, and when prompted, enter the webinar ID 978-5631-6133. And I want to remind you, you can ask questions throughout. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can after our opening remarks. They are welcome, these questions. Use the Q&A button at the bottom to help you ask those questions. And a special shout out to Minnesota 201. It's the Alumni Association's non-partisan advocacy network that informs key alumni and advances both legislative advocacy and the university overall. If you're interested in joining Minnesota 201, you can reach out to the Alumni Association to get that information. But now on to our main event. We have two amazing panelists today. I am your moderator, Roshini Rajkumar. I'm a crisis and executive coach, and you may have heard my show, Real Talk with Roshini, on WCCO radio, 9 to noon on Sundays. I just had the pleasure of interviewing one of our panelists this past Sunday, and I've interviewed Secretary of State Steve Simon many times. He became Minnesota's 22nd Secretary of State in 2015. And at that time, he promised that he would work with anyone of any political affiliation from any part of Minnesota to protect, defend, and strengthen the right to vote in Minnesota. His goals as Minnesota Secretary of State are straightforward. They are to expand access to voting and remove barriers to voting. Steve grew up in St. Louis Park and Hopkins. He graduated with a BA in poli-sci from Tufts in Massachusetts. He earned a JD from University of Minnesota Law School in 1996. He and his wife Leah live in Hopkins with their two children and their rescue dog, Hugo. Professor Tim Lindbergh is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Minnesota Morris. He has a PhD from the State University of New York at Albany and an alumnus of U of M Morris. His research focuses on rural politics and political values, particularly of rural Midwesterners in the 2000s. Among his current projects is a biannual survey of rural Americans exploring the connections between rural place-based identity and political beliefs. Professor Lindbergh teaches classes about political participation and political psychology. And it was very wonderful to talk with him about the psychology of voting this past Sunday on my show. I'm sure we'll get into some of that. We also invite you to tweet today while you're watching, and you saw on the screen the handles, but I'll remind you, I am at Roshini R. Professor Lindbergh is at Prof. Timmy, kind of catchy, Professor. And of course, Secretary of State Steve Simon is at MN Steve Simon. All right, we're going to start by having Secretary of State Steve Simon give us some opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Roshini. I want to thank the University of Minnesota. I am a proud alum, class of '96 of the University of Minnesota Law School. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that our moderator was just 1 year behind me in law school, so we were kind of classmates. I want to thank you all. This is a momentous time, obviously. I like to say that our office is in the democracy business. And what a time to be in the democracy business. Here we are 27 days from a really significant, really consequential presidential election. Early on in the COVID crisis and the pandemic in March and April, it became very clear to our office that we had to view this election, at least in part, through a public health lens. And let me give you a math problem that informed our thinking on it. You didn't think there would be math this close to lunch. There is some math. It's simple math. Here's the math. We have about 3,000 polling places in Minnesota. We're expecting about 3 million voters in Minnesota, probably more, but that's a conservative estimate. That means about 1,000 to 1 ratio, 1,000 people per polling place in Minnesota on average. It's a very rough average. And so from a public health standpoint, we want to try to get that number down. And don't just take my word for it. Look at the CDC right now, if you can, on their website. They have guidance about this. No one is saying that polling places are a death trap that you should run for your lives. I'm not, and they're not. We are saying it's sensible to use your head, to take common sense mitigation measures up to and including looking for other avenues to vote, which is why this year in particular, I and we are emphasizing the need for people to take a good hard look at voting from home. You don't have to. Every method of legal voting is equally worthy, equally valuable and legitimate, but voting from home in Minnesota is easy and has some real side benefits. You just go to mnvotes.org, that's the website, mnvotes.org. It will take you maximum 5 minutes to get that ballot back. Now, normally the reason to do so, and the reason why it was already gaining in popularity rather, even as of 2018, is comfort and convenience, that you can vote with your feet up. You can vote while you're watching TV or folding laundry or doing anything at home. But this year, there's something more going on. First, it's about minimizing one's own risk, obviously, but there's something else too, and that is this idea, this public service idea, that every person who votes from home is making it just a little bit safer for everyone who chooses the other option, which is to vote traditionally in the polling place. So it's really a win-win. Those who vote from home get the advantage of peace of mind and perhaps minimizing risk. Those who choose to vote in the polling place, there won't be 1,000 people coursing through there with their droplets over the period of a day of voting. Instead, it's looking like, based on the sky-high numbers, it'll be closer to 600. We already have 1.2 million Minnesotans, 1.2 million as of last Friday, that have already asked to have their ballot sent from home. To put that number in perspective, that same number in the last presidential election was a couple 100,000. We're already, with about 4 weeks left even, at 1.2 million. So people are taking to this method of voting, and that is evening things out and metering things out among the three main ways to vote. There's in-person on election day, there's in-person absentee before election day, like today, tomorrow, and the next day, and then there's voting from home. And we're urging people to take a look at voting from home, and they are doing that. So that frames, at least from the perspective of our office, some of the discussion, and I hope we'll get into a lot of questions or comments or pushback or feedback on that and other issues. Thank you.
All right, Professor Tim Lindbergh, I know you have some opening statements for us.
Yes, thank you, Roshini, and thank you, Steve, for your comments. I did want to note, too, Steve talked about the 2016 election in Minnesota, and I want to start off by just noting that roughly 2.95 million votes were cast for one of the presidential candidates that year. That's about 75% of all Minnesotans who were eligible to vote. And that was the highest proportion in the United States. There were a couple other states really near us, but Minnesota is usually in the top 2 or 3 states in terms of voting turnout. But that still means that 1 out of every 4 Minnesotans who could vote did not exercise their civic duty to do so in 2016. And some people don't vote because they feel like it doesn't matter. Some people don't vote because they don't have the time or ability to do so. Some people don't vote because they have an administrative hurdle in their way. Some people don't vote because they don't like the current parties, candidates, or system of politics. But voting matters even if your preferred candidates, parties, and issues lose out. Voting is not a strictly rational decision. It is an emotional and motivated one. We care about our government, our society, and our communities, and we vote to have a say. You shouldn't be voting because it might be the difference. In many elections, there's millions of votes. You should be voting because it matters. You have the ability to have the same influence in one important moment as everyone else. That's why you should always vote. Today, however, misinformation, conspiracies, and lies run rampant in our politics. They've existed before. This is not the worst our politics has ever been and not the most partisan we've ever been. But we do need to have some common ground to understand each other, to disagree upon, and to drive compromises into the future. We rely on media to tell us about our world and communication from our political leaders, but we are being fed lies and half-truths from too many places. Alternative facts might have become a meme, but it rings too true. Despite this feeling, there are facts out there. We can interpret them differently, argue for different policies, and vote in different ways using those same facts. We don't need to invent new ones. There are also processes that work, are fair, and are effective to make sure people can exercise their rights to participate in politics. Politicians exaggerate or misconstrue how politics works and why. They create a partisan narrative for their own goals. It is important to recognize why these narratives exist, but also to realize that they are there for their strategic goals, not because of the way we as individuals want to vote. So I hope I can, along with Secretary of State Simon today, alleviate some concerns by talking about not only the processes and institutions around voting, but also about the psychology behind how and why we make voting choices within this particularly hyper-partisan politics of 2020.
Thank you so much, Professor. And we have so many great questions that have already come in. We definitely recommend if you get your question in, you can ask that question in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But let's start with some questions about the technical details of voting this year. And I know, Secretary Simon, you've shared some of those in opening remarks. You've been tweeting like crazy. I give you credit for the last 6 weeks about things, maybe even longer. But let's talk through that, because a number of questions came in, such as what happens if ballots are not delivered on time? Will they get counted? What if I first ask for a vote to be mailed to me, but then I decide to go on election day? So if you can just really clearly spell out every option for voting and give us some sort of sense that our vote will count.
Absolutely. Well, let me try to address both of the ideas that were embedded in that question. First, let me talk about timeliness, okay? So this year and this year only, we have a very special, unique 2020 only rule in place through court order, the result of some litigation. It's very on brand for 2020, meaning it's a one and only, that's it. And here's the rule this year if you vote from home by mail. The rule is you can postmark it as late as election day. That's different. Usually the rule is you got to get it there by election day. Not this year. It's a more forgiving, more generous rule. You can postmark it by election day as long as it arrives 1 week later by Tuesday, November 10th. That's the rule. If it arrives on the 11th or the 12th, you're out and it's out. It will not be counted. But you get an automatic 7-day cushion. So that's the rule there. In terms of changing your mind, it is not uncommon. So if you go to mnvotes.org right now and you order a ballot to come to you at home, and then once it comes, or after that, or as election day nears, you say, you know what, I know that I got maybe carried away and I ordered that ballot to come to me at home, but I don't want to do that anymore. I want to either vote in person absentee or vote in person on game day, on election day. You can do that. It's no problem. That's not illegal. It happens fairly frequently. People change their mind and you can do that. You don't even have to bring it with you. It will just be invalidated. There's a barcode attached to every voter and to every ballot, and it will just be invalidated the same way when you cancel payment on a check, that is invalidated. So it'll be
So a quick follow-up on that, Secretary Simon. So what you're saying is there's a barcode, and the barcode that came to you in the mail would be different from the barcode if you go to a polling place and vote.
Correct.
So your name is attached, can only be attached to one barcode. So if somehow that other barcode comes in somehow, you're saying that your team will recognize that and reject it because that barcode with, let's say, my name was already counted on November 3rd at the poll.
Well put. Yes, that's right. So here's another scenario not asked by the questioner, but one that's related. What if you send your ballot in, I don't know, a few days before the election, and election day comes around and you're a little nervous? You're going to mnvotes.org where we have a ballot tracker feature where you can know with certainty when it has arrived. It's November 3rd and you're pushing refresh every hour and you're not seeing that your ballot has arrived. So you say, I can't risk it. I got to go to the polling place. It's in transit. It's somewhere. The Postal Service has it. But I'm going to go. I want to vote. I don't want to be disenfranchised. I'm going to vote. And you do. You vote in person, which is perfectly fine. And then after that, the ballot that was in transit does come in and does land by election day. That second ballot, the second to arrive, will be invalidated. You won't have voted twice. You won't have committed a felony, but it'll just simply be invalidated based on the vote that you already cast in person.
Right, I'm glad you're sharing that because there has been, as Professor Lindbergh said, a lot of misinformation out there and certain scare tactics that I would say both political parties are using. No one is immune from that, but I like to get that from you, our Secretary of State, that you are not planning for some rampant fraud, but if it does exist, you have put measures in place.
Correct.
Okay. Professor Lindbergh, let me go to you on some of the psychology behind this, because people get so nervous that something will go wrong with that ballot. Is there any advice that you have, someone who's studied this and voting behavior? You know, if someone's a last minute kind of person, do you have some advice for them right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Secretary of State Steve Simon pointed to this, is if you are going to do this a little bit later, you do have those 3 different options. You do have the option of even if you do request it and you're not sure if it's going to get there in time, you're not sure if you sent it in time, go to your voting precinct on the day of the election and make sure that your vote does count. You also, I mean, and this is how I voted. We got my wife and I got our absentee ballots. We were going to mail them in. We had some questions about, there was a little bit of a mix up with the addresses. And so we had some administrative questions. We went into the county auditor's office and within 10 minutes had our votes counted, our ballots counted in terms of being accepted by the county auditor. So even that process was very easy. So you can go in to your county auditor or wherever your ballot can be delivered in person. So not on the day of the election, you can do it beforehand. So I think there's a couple different options for people who are really sort of late to the game on this. I think the easiest thing would be try to overcome that this year and get your ballot as soon as possible so that you have time. And then it also is really helpful because if you have more time, as we kind of talked about on your radio show the other day, if you have more time to look at the candidates, to do research, to figure out who you should be voting for in each of these elections, it provides a service that you just simply can't do if you show up on the day of election and you're sitting there in the voting booth. You can't, pull out your phone and do research for 30 minutes on the candidates then. It allows you that benefit in the moment to do that. So I would highly suggest anybody wanting to do this, again, this Secretary of State said, get your ballot now, request it now. You can look at the sample ballot while it's in transit and you're waiting for it to do the research so that when it gets there, you can complete it and send it off and you don't have to worry. And then you can track it on the website as well.
Yeah, and a bit of a reality check. It is October 7th. People, there's time. Get your ballots. There's no excuse to push this into November if you're not going to the polls on November 3rd. You've got the whole month of October to do the research that Professor Lindbergh is suggesting. On that note, Professor and Secretary of State Simon, we've received several questions about your advice for the best way to research these candidates. There are so many offices. Google may have correct information. It may not. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So one of our viewers today wants to know, how do I get real unbiased info that isn't just coming from a candidate? We'll start with you, Secretary.
Well, I don't know if this will meet the bias threshold or not, but if you go to our website, mnvotes.org, again, there's a My Ballot feature. And this goes to what is even on your ballot. As some people might say, boy, in my area, am I even voting on county commissioner or school board? I have no idea whether that's up in my area this year. Just type in your address and up will come the candidates with links to their websites. So it's biased, but it's the candidates in their own words. So that's a feature that we provide. But I'd be interested in Professor Lindbergh's analysis in terms of just being news consumers. It is confusing to navigate all that out there.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think, this is probably one of the toughest things to find out, especially when you're talking about, if you're talking about obviously the presidency, the Senate race, you've got lots of information out there that it's hard not to know something about the Jason Lewis and Tina Smith race with the other candidates there, or the presidential race. It gets harder when you're getting into the Minnesota State and Senate and House, and then even harder when you're talking about county commissioners, school boards, city council. In some cities like Minneapolis, you probably have more information than others. Here in Morris, right, you rely on our local paper to provide candidates usually with a little bit of a forum and to put out their views. Again, that's in their own words. So if they have websites, I think what the secretary is saying is go to their websites. Yes, it's biased in the sense that they're going to present themselves in the best light, but that also it gives you an opportunity to say, are they presenting themselves in a way that I feel represents me? These candidates do have to make some semblance of an appeal, a persuasive appeal. And if they're not doing that, that by itself tells you something about their candidacy, that they're maybe not serious, or they don't really have principles or goals that they want to see put into place. But I do think it gets harder the more local you get, especially if you're in smaller towns, towns without newspapers. It's incredibly difficult, I think. But But at the same time, when you're talking about local races, sometimes these are people that you know or you can reach out to in your community. And, if you have that opportunity, do so. Reach out to them. Ask them about their candidacy. We've had in Morris a couple of people who are running for local offices even go around, obviously, with their masks on and being very conscientious about social distancing, but asking people if they have questions about their candidacy. So there's opportunities on the local level to get to know some of those candidates, but it is a difficult thing to find a lot of good information.
Well, there is something to be said also, Professor, about hearing what the candidate and his or her team has to say in their own voice. And so when you read things on their own campaign websites, like you say, you can decide, is this type of person for me? This question came in Sunday when I was interviewing Professor Lindbergh on my show, and a listener texted in, go to the League of Women Voters, their site and their information. There's a lot there. So, it does involve some research. It does involve time, but, this is a right and a privilege of our Constitution. So there are a lot of rules that we live by to vote. And Secretary Simon, this person has a question about poll watchers and the possibility of voters being intimidated. I understand there are state-by-state rules about this. Can you give us an update on Minnesota?
Yeah, actually, this is kind of a fresh topic. It came up in last week's presidential debate. The question is, can any candidate urge his or her followers to go in large numbers to the polling place to watch, to be poll watchers? In Minnesota law, there are a lot of specific details. There's not much left to the imagination. In our state statutes, we call them challengers. And the rule in Minnesota is that every major political party gets only one, maximum of one person that they can designate in writing to be a challenger in a polling place. Must be a written designation. And once they get to the polling place, challengers may not be within 6 feet of a voter. They may not talk to a voter. Any challenges to a voter's eligibility must be in writing, and here's the kicker, under our state statutes, must be based on personal knowledge. That's the exact phrase, personal knowledge. So for example, a poll challenger could say, hey, I know her, she lives on my block, she's 17 years old, she's not eligible to vote. Or I know him, at our last National Night Out party, he was showing everyone his Norwegian passport, he's not even American. That's fine, that's personal knowledge. You can't do it based on a whim or a hunch or a bad vibe or a guess or a feeling. You can't say, she looks, or I've got a bad feeling about him, or I heard her speaking a language other than English. That's not good enough. So it's pretty specific and pretty limited in Minnesota.
Speaking of rules, one viewer wants to know about rules around buttons and clothing and other kinds of things that may demarcate who you're voting for or a topic you're voting on.
So this is interesting. For those following the legal landscape, there 2 years ago was a US Supreme Court case on this that arose out of Minnesota. It was a challenge to a Minnesota statute. And so now we have clarity that's very homegrown and Minnesota based. And the bottom line rule now is the only political paraphernalia, buttons, badges, you name it, that you can ban right now at a polling place are those things that depict a candidate or a political party on the ballot that day. That's it. So you can't on November 3rd wear your Trump Biden t-shirts or buttons, but you could wear your Al Franken t-shirt or your Norm Coleman hat or your Mark Dayton.
From another year.
Right, from another year. And the court was pretty explicit too, though, that that you cannot limit things that just have a political connotation. Mm-hmm. So if you have something that says, I'm pro-life and I vote, or I'm pro-choice and I vote, that's fine. That cannot be banned. But if it depicts or names a particular candidate or party on the ballot that very day, you can ban that in essence and ask the voter to remove that article.
All right, Professor Lindbergh, you got into in your opening remarks how this really isn't necessarily the worst times America has faced, even though many people believe that. It's very cantankerous out there. And one of our questioners who sent this in ahead of time, it's such a great question, the insight that you have about polarized times in the past, like way back even to the founders of our nation. Can you give us some, shed some light on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we think about the founding era, in particular, our founding fathers in the United States as, very wise and very prescient about creating this constitution, creating this political system that would push into the future and be always there for us with a lot of flexibility. And in some ways they did that. Obviously there were flaws in the Constitution. We fought a civil war and all those types of things. But at the same time, and this is with, an understanding that political parties are problematic. So they didn't even have partisanship in the way that we do now. They called each other out. They called each other's wives' names. They called each other's mother's name. I mean, it was bad. If you look back at the newspapers in the late 1700s, the name calling, I mean, it makes what's going on right now between, President Trump and Vice President Biden look relatively tame. I mean, there's still examples, and of course we live in a different time, so it's not exactly a comparative examples, but this is not the only time we've gotten this sort of mudslingy atmosphere. And then you have polarized times, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when partisanship was really, really high. There were issues around industrialization that are similar to the inequality in economics that we have now. Issues of racial tensions that are were much higher than they are now with Jim Crow laws in the South in particular. So we've had times before where we've been here. It's not necessarily to say that it's a good thing that we're so polarized or partisan, but it is a good reminder that this is not the only time. This is not unique. And I don't say that to suggest, oh, don't worry, we'll get through it again, but more just to make people realize that this is a normal sort of cycle of politics, that we do become more partisan and then tend to drift away from partisanship as the parties switch over what issues that they care about. And so, thinking about what do we want as voters? What do we want as a society for our politicians and our parties to focus on? Do we want more compromise? How do we get back to a system where politicians are incentivized to compromise more and to think across the aisle and to do bipartisan measures versus where we're at now?
Well, the great thing about this panel, your vote is your voice. It really says it all. So voting is so important. I know the three of us are so dedicated to it. And Secretary Simon, I mean, you live and breathe this stuff. Here's a real, I think, creative question from one of our viewers today. Should voting rights for felons be restored? What can Minnesota do to enfranchise this often discriminated against population?
I think the short answer is yes. And just a quick kind of description of the lay of the land. So there are basically four categories of states. One category, Vermont and Maine, you never lose your right to vote. You could be serving a 400-year sentence for multiple murders and you can still vote from prison. Only Maine and Vermont. No one is saying that should be done here, me included. Then there's the next group of states that say it's a bright line rule. If you're in prison, you can't vote, but the minute you get out of prison, you can. Then there's Minnesota. Minnesota finds itself in the next group, which says you only get your right to vote back when your entire sentence is done, the prison part and the so-called on paper part, which can last for many, many years, particularly in Minnesota. And finally, there's a category of states, about 7 or 8 or 9 states, where you either practically or actually never get your right back to vote. So I support moving Minnesota from its current category to the other category of a bright line rule. I think it not only makes sense administratively, but more importantly, I think it's the right thing to do. I think when you left prison behind, you've rejoined society because someone has decided that you are worthy and you're paying taxes and you're trying to get your life back together and your family's life back together. I think it's the right thing to do to give people that ownership, that investment, that power to vote. We have, it's tough to know at any one time, probably somewhere north of 60,000 people in Minnesota who fit that description. The reason it's particularly important in Minnesota is historically, on a bipartisan basis, we have, through the law, weighted our sentences more on the paper part than the prison part. So in a state like Louisiana, I only pick it because it's the #1 per capita for incarceration, crime X might result in 8 years in prison and 5 years of supervised release. In Minnesota, it might be, I'm just making up a number here, 3 years in prison and 15 years of supervised release. The Star Tribune did a story not too long ago, a few months ago, about a woman in her early 30s who will not be able to vote until she's in her early 70s. She has 40 years of being on paper. And so because Minnesota in particular tends to weight its sentences that way, it results in a fundamental unfairness with people who are out for years or decades, have put their lives together and have put their crimes behind them and can't have a say in who governs them and how. So I support the movement, which has been done in North Dakota, in Iowa, in Florida, in red states, in blue states. And I think we ought to jump on that train.
Do you have a sense it's gaining momentum here? I mean, this is not something that I hear about all the time.
Yeah, it is. And actually, it is genuinely bipartisan in the legislature, not in that sort of token kind of way. There are liberal Democrats and multiple conservative Republicans who are strong supporters of this idea. So I hope to see some momentum and ultimately victory in the next year or two.
Let's take a look at how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected voting. So we have several questions about that. I'll kind of group them together. What do you think, and I'll start with you, Professor Lindbergh, this pandemic has taught us about voting, and are there any good things that have arisen from COVID-19 when it comes to voting?
So I think that the biggest thing it's taught us is that even a health pandemic, regardless of how serious you think it is in terms of the broad spectrum of society, that we can continue to perform the democracy that we all love and take for granted, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that we can hold elections. I mean, the primaries, obviously, some of them were very messy, but some of the messiest primaries were actually the ones that happened before COVID even came to the United States, right? The electronic issues in Iowa were probably some of the worst examples of how the primaries didn't work. So COVID itself wasn't even actually necessarily the thing that was most problematic, but it also, I think, demonstrates to some degree how we also live in an antiquated world in terms of how we think about elections, in the sense that we sometimes rely too much on technology in our elections, so we don't have enough safeguards. I know one of the great things about Minnesota is we have the electronic and the paper versions that we keep, but where some states only do the electronic version. The second you submit it, it's just electronic, and so some of those safeguards. But then at other times we don't rely on technology enough, or new ways of doing things. Just the idea of mail-in balloting as there's only a few states that do it in full, and only a couple of them have been doing it more than a decade. And I think this might move us towards more options for that, more states that have that ability. And we see slight increases usually in states that adopt those in terms of turnout numbers. But if nothing else, it just provides easier access to everyone to vote.
All right, let's talk a little bit about, this is kind of connected to COVID, right? This has just been a hot, crazy year, as you alluded to, Secretary Simon, in your remarks. This year, I hope we don't live through another similar year with all the crazy headlines. But in connection with the pandemic, there's also been a real uptick in polarization. Any advice from either of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Secretary Simon, that you can see, because our viewers are wondering, is there anything that would come out of this, and in how elections are being done in Minnesota, that maybe can reduce some of the polarization?
Yes, and let me speak to a specific slice in time that's coming up as maybe an example where we all can and really should come together. I am concerned as an American and as a Minnesotan about what happens in the days and maybe couple weeks following Election Day. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, we have this special rule where you can postmark by Election Day as long as it gets in a week later. That means, by definition, we won't have all the results until 1 week later. We'll have most beforehand, but not all. And my worry is that on a polarized basis or partisan basis or ideological basis, that 1 week period in Minnesota and longer in other states will be fertile ground for disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and the like. I think it's important for all of us, no matter where we sit or stand politically, just to take a step back, to zoom out a little bit and say that when we see on election night that 100% of the ballots aren't in, that we don't have the same instant gratification that we're used to in Minnesota or almost any other state that night, that we just understand and realize and can come together on one point, the realization that this is by design, literally by design of the legislature this year, which passed special bills to allow for more time for counting, and by design of the courts through court orders of the kind that I've already described, others we haven't gotten to yet. So this is not the result, no matter who you're for or against, this is not the result of somebody screwing up or failing to plan. To the contrary, this is the plan. We're just going to have to do what we've done for so long, and I think pretty well as a society for the last 7 months, which is be patient, be adaptable, be flexible, and we're going to get to results sooner rather than later. So that's one moment that I hope we can all come together and just understand when we see that lag in time. No one is rigging anything, stealing anything, concealing anything. This is the way it's been planned on a bipartisan basis, I might add.
And I'll just add from the media front, my past life, I was a television reporter, and we as reporters, we're not supposed to have opinions. And that has really changed. I mean, I'm now a talk show host, so I'm paid to have an opinion.
Right.
But reporters who you're watching on social, reading or listening to, or whatever it is, watching on the TV, keep in mind that you need to be discerning as a voter and make sure who you're consuming, the different outlets you're consuming are checking their facts and are going to the sources of information and are not just spewing their own opinions or something they picked up on Twitter and are running with it. So we as voters, as Americans, it's incumbent upon us to be discerning, and that sometimes often gets lost in the fray. And I really hope we can have peace after this election while many things are getting sorted out. Secretary Simon has already outlined that there's going to be a lag time in getting those final numbers. And I really hope the networks don't call the election of any office too early so that all the states can catch up and count their ballots. Professor Lindbergh, what are your thoughts about this? Because I know you're studying the psychology of politics and voting behavior.
Yeah, I think to add to what the Secretary of State already said is that not only do we have to keep in mind that it might take a little while in Minnesota, and while that might not mean we don't know who won the presidency, because maybe there's the gap's big enough that the number of votes that we think are out there are just not enough to overcome it. So no matter what, but we also have lots of other races on the ballot. Not only do you have those local ones, but you have the state house ones, the state senate ones. And in some of these districts, you're talking about 10 to 25, 30,000 voters at most. If a quarter of them or even a tenth of them don't decide to turn it in until very late, and those elections are close, we may not know who controls Minnesota State House or Minnesota State Senate for a week or two afterwards, for sure, right? And if it's very close, then we get into all sorts of recount stuff. But it's also worth noting that Minnesota is different than other states. Some other states have have a similar thing where the courts have ordered additional time for ballots to come in. Other states, the courts have said no to those things, or the legislatures have done something different, or they had different rules in the first place. And so one of the things I think is the most important is not only realizing that on election night we may not know the results of the presidential election or other elections that are very important, who wins the Senate, for the example, on the US scale, but also that different states are going to have different timelines for getting votes in. For one example, California is notoriously slow at getting their ballots in, and they have millions and millions and millions. 10 times as many voters as Minnesota does. They have elections that they can change 70, 80,000 votes over the course of the additional ballots that are coming in. And again, as Secretary of State said, there's nothing fraudulent about that. It's literally the law. It's the ability of voters to turn them in, very close to the election date, and them to be postmarked by then and received later. And so we need to keep this in mind. And again, some states are going to matter more than others. If there's still a number of outstanding votes in a state that we know is, say President Trump is up by 30% in, it's unlikely Biden's coming back, right? So there are ways to analyze and understand how that's happening, but we shouldn't take anything for granted on the night of that. If we go to bed and it's still not clear who's won, whoever's up may not win the election, and there's nothing fraudulent about that.
Secretary Simon, I want to get into that a little more, because as we say here today, your vote is your voice. And it always annoys me when only like 30% of the votes are totaled and different offices, races are being called. What insight can you give Minnesotans on, do you set the tone? Do you say, hey, you cannot call a race until 85% or 90% of the votes are in? I've always been very curious about that. No one's ever really given me a straight answer.
Yeah, well, I just have to say, not to pass the buck, but we steer clear of that. We report the numbers, and if a media outlet like the AP, for example, which is very aggressive in this space nationally in Minnesota, if the AP, Associated Press, calls a race, we can't prevent them from doing that. They can do that. They can face the blowback from their readers, listeners, viewers, but we don't do that. We provide the numbers, and this election, we're going to have to provide extra. because what we plan to provide on election night is, look, folks, here's what's come in so far. So everything's commingled. There's no segregation by type or category, absentee versus game day. That's it. Here's all the stuff that's come in. And by the way, we can start counting the absentees 14 days before. We got a 14-day head start to dig into that mountain of mail that's going to be coming in, which is great. Other states don't have that. So on election night, you'll know that. But the other thing you'll know from our office is we'll be able to break it down by House, which is more granular than the law says we have to do. We'll be able to break down by House district the number of outstanding absentee votes. So you might know on election night, for example, that candidate A is ahead of candidate B by 500 votes in a House district, but there are 300 absentee votes left to count, and we don't know when they're coming in the next week. It could be tomorrow, the next day, up to the following Tuesday. That would enable media outlets to make those calls. In the example I just gave, it's mathematically a certainty that candidate A would win. She's up by 500, there's only 300 outstanding, but some may be more complicated hypotheticals. So we provide the numbers, and we steer clear, of course, of calling or predicting or putting a check mark by anyone's names. We just do not do that.
All right, we have some great questions coming in on the Q&A, and if others have questions for Secretary of State Steve Simon or Professor Tim Lindbergh, please put those in at the Q&A in the bottom of your screen. Stephen is asking this: do you know if there have been difficulties finding election judges, and are there still opportunities to volunteer to take on that role?
I can take that one. It's something we have treated extremely seriously in light of some of the horror stories during the primary season. Professor Lindbergh rightly referred to some technical glitches. There were other glitches in states like Wisconsin and Georgia. Massive overcrowding and long lines, occasioned in large part because of chronic understaffing. Last minute, people bailing out, people who had signed up and because of COVID said, I can't do it. So we have really worked with counties and cities. They're the ones who hire and train and pay them. We don't, but we really want to have their backs. Bottom line to the questioner, most places, and we check in constantly with counties and cities, most places feel pretty good, but the one sub issue where there are some challenges still are not necessarily getting bodies, but the right bodies, so to speak. We have a partisan balance requirement in Minnesota. Not all the judges, but substantially all must be divided evenly among principally the Democratic and Republican parties. And predictably, and particularly in these polarized times, there are deep blue areas like Minneapolis where they are begging for Republican judges. So talk about full employment. If you're a Republican and you want to do this, they will be bidding over you in Minneapolis.
I didn't realize you had to put a label on this. I would have thought this was a nonpartisan kind of a role.
Well, here's the thing. It's not public. So you're not sort of outing yourself to the world. It's only for purposes of that day. It's not public data. No one except the people you're working with that day. And you can change your mind the next day and say, well, I was a Democrat that day, but now I'm a Republican. Similarly, in certain areas in greater Minnesota that are more conservative and more Republican, at least traditionally, they are scrounging to find blue judges. And so you can make your own judgment about where those areas are. But if you're one of the parties that you know, you belong to a party where you think a place will need you, you can go. And just one other thing about that, Roshini, our rules are very forgiving and generous on election judges. You are not tethered to your county or city at all. If you live in Minneapolis and you hear they need help in Morris or vice versa, you can go there if they'll have you and you're willing to travel, or Minneapolis and Minnetonka and vice versa, wherever. You are not tethered in any way to where you live. So you can call a particular jurisdiction, or you can go to our website, mnvotes.org, and fill out an interest form to do that.
Secretary Simon, what a great reason for an excursion to another part of the state.
That's right, exactly.
This is from Roger Rose for Professor Lindbergh. How close are the various races so far? Are we seeing a greater trend to rural voters shifting to GOP? What are polls saying about the regional support for presidential and Senate candidates?
Yeah, so for one of the things that has shifted over the past decade, it was definitely happening before 2016 with President Trump and that election, but it really was visible on a very broad scale in Minnesota, across other states in the Midwest too, is this shift of Republican support, particularly for Trump, but we saw it in 2018 when Trump wasn't on the ballot as well, of rural areas shifting more heavily towards the Republican Party, urban areas and suburban areas, so that you could think of like what we call them, the donut rings of suburbs around the Twin Cities, shifting towards Democrats. And we saw this play out in the Minnesota House races, where basically if you are a Minnesota House Minnesota House member, and you're from Greater Minnesota, the only way, the only Democrats are in particularly the larger urban areas outside of the Twin Cities. Whereas as recently as like 2012, 2014, there were a number of DFL Minnesota House members who were from relatively rural areas, and there were some conservative Republicans representing suburbs, even sort of the inner ring or second ring suburbs of the Twin Cities area. And so you see this more divergent pattern now between the two areas, and I think that will continue in 2020. I think one of the things that I always mention about looking at those maps and going, oh, the red and the blue and all this other things, is you don't always see how big of a shift it was. And so in some of the areas of rural Minnesota, the shifts were pretty big. I mean, you're talking 20-30% shifts. In other areas, it was 5 to 10%, which is enough to take some of those areas from competitive toss-up races where the DFL member might win an election and then the Republican might win the next one and go back and forth, to an election where the Republican easily wins, but it's only by 7 or 8%, right? That's not a huge shift. It's enough of a shift to make it look like it's all one or the other. But in a lot of these places, we still have somewhat relatively competitive races. It's just not what we consider toss-up or within that 5 to 10% range. But 60-40 is still, most people are, on one side or the other. It's not that lopsided. And so I think it's a good thing to remember that. And then I think the last thing just to mention about what's going on with this year in terms of the polling, and we see pretty consistent polling on the Minnesota statewide races, again, as we've seen in the last couple of election cycles, where Democrats tend to do pretty strongly in statewide elections, but the parties are going to be pretty competitive in who wins the state house, who wins the state senate. I wouldn't be surprised to see Republicans gain a few seats in the state house, but I think DFL will continue to hold the majority there. The state senate is anybody's guess. There are a number of seats from 2018 where the Democrats won seats that were kind of surprising, and Republicans, I think, are trying to take those back. So I think the state senate is really where I'm looking and really interested in on the state level for what's happening for these elections.
It's so important to remember that major decisions for each of our lives truly made at the local level, whether that's school board, city council, mayoral, a number of those kinds of elections, and some that aren't necessarily out there in commercials and yard signs. And you've seen some commercials asking people to flip over the ballot and remember the judges. Secretary Simon, one person has a question about judicial races. They can be confusing. This person wants to know, what are the requirements to being a judge?
Yes. Well, the requirements to being a judge, it's very interesting in Minnesota. They're the normal constitutional requirements for being a candidate. There's no special age requirement like there for president. You must be, you have a legal background. It's a little murky, learned in the law. But we have an interesting system in Minnesota, of course, where judges stand for election. Let's just zoom out and talk about that. There are other states that have so-called retention elections, where it's not a competitive contest. It's just yay or nay on Judge X. Should she continue? Should he continue? Minnesota's one of the number of states that has actual competitive elections. When you turn over that ballot, you will see, and this is why sometimes people don't do that, that most of them are not contested. There are a few that are contested. Statewide one, Court of Appeals and Supreme Court tend to be more contested than district court races. Once in a while there are, but please don't let your eyes glaze over and tell your neighbors not to either. I mean, there are a lot of contests in terms of numbers, and yes, many of them are uncontested, but it's important that you vote for those, even the ones that are uncontested. I think the judiciary looks at that. I think they listen to that. They want to know that folks who are returned to office are returned with somewhat of a mandate.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, the questions that come up, and I want to go to the Q&A screen because we have some great questions coming in. Ed is asking about final results. Ed says, it sounds like both sides are very likely to contest the results regardless of the final tally, and I'm assuming Ed is talking about presidential. Is this definitely going to the Supreme Court? Is it going to be decided in the House? How long can this drag out before we finally have to declare a winner?
Well, I'd be interested in Professor Lindbergh's take on that as well from a political science standpoint. I can just tell you from the technical standpoint, there are certain dates that are fixed, absolutely fixed. One is December 14th. That's the date when I and other secretaries of state will convene the Electoral College in our states. That is a fixed date. The other fixed date, of course, is January 20th, 2021. Those are fixed, folks. There is no postponing those dates. So whatever happens on the litigation level, we'll have to weave in and out of those dates. There are so many different hypotheticals and scenarios out there. I hesitate to address any one. I will just point out this in Minnesota. We've had some knockdown, drag out recounts in Minnesota. Coleman Franken, we one that started but didn't finish in 2010 in our governor's race. The rule in Minnesota is there's an automatic taxpayer financed recount if a statewide result is closer than 1/4%. But that's only the threshold for a taxpayer financed recount. Anyone can order a recount in any race if they will pay for it. So you could have a presidential or any statewide candidate in Minnesota who loses by 500,000 votes or 1 million votes. And if they want to pay for a recount, they can do it. And I dare say that on the federal level, paying for a statewide recount, that would be 1 or 2 blast emails sent from the DNC or the RNC, right? They could raise that 5, 6, 7 million overnight. If they really cared about a state like Minnesota, if it was close enough, but not within the taxpayer finance recount threshold, they could do it. As long as they pay for it, we could have a recount. It's possible.
Well, I'm going to remain an optimist with all of you and other of your colleagues, secretaries of state around the nation, really reminding people, advising people more than ever this year compared with other presidential years. I really hope people are listening to your advice so that we don't have to assume a lot of these recounts are needed anywhere. I'm going to remain an optimist. Professor Lindbergh, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I've been telling people in my classes and anybody else who asks me a question about the complexities of what's going on, I say, let's just hope this election's a lot easier than any of us think it will be in terms of it. There's a clear winner. At this point, it's like, it doesn't matter which winner it is. I just want a clear winner, right? If regardless, because it going to the Supreme Court, that is something none of us want. Again, we do not want a Bush v. Gore 2 case situation, in particular because the legal aspects are so much different than the ethical, sort of moral and societal ramifications of them. If you look at the Bush v. Gore case from a legal standpoint, some things make more sense than they do from sort of like the perspective that a lot of people have of that, the Supreme Court deciding who's president. And we definitely don't want the courts. The courts don't want to be there either. People ascribe motivations to the courts, and I don't think the courts want to wade into anything that political ever. And so they would rather be out of it as well. We definitely don't want it to go to the House. That is a messy process that frankly doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It is unlike anything else. It's not each member of the House, it's the state delegations, which is all sorts of a mess and complicated. So let's just hope none of that happens. Is there a chance that both of those scenarios do happen? Yeah, there's a tiny chance, particularly the Supreme Court or the court challenges. I think there will be some. But I think the easiest way to think about that is, as Secretary of State said, if there aren't enough close states, it doesn't make sense for the candidates to do a lot of litigation to buy those recounts. Other states have different laws for what threshold it is and when you can do it or can't do it. So Minnesota is not unique in the sense that it has an option, but it is a different threshold than it might be in other states, and who has to pay for it and all that. But I don't see that being necessarily an issue if most states, or if enough states to make the difference in the Electoral College, aren't close enough, right? There's no reason to litigate states that are close if you've already lost the Electoral College, regardless if you win those states. So
right, and in the theme of your vote is your voice, we hope that various people, including the parties, can respect what ends up being the voice of the people. All right, we're running up against the clock. I want to get to as many of these fab questions as I can, so I'll ask you gentlemen to keep your answers brief. On this next one, this person says, what is Secretary Simon's advice, but I'd love both of your advice, regarding high school teachers coaching and encouraging voter registration? Is it okay to make participation a graded assignment?
Oh man, I don't want to get any teacher in trouble here. I would just say, I assume so. Talk to your principal or superintendent, I guess. But yeah, young people, we do a mock election We partner with YMCA Youth in Government, and we're up to 500 some schools around Minnesota right now. So that's a way to gin up some real interest at all age levels. Just the physical act of voting, about making a choice and thinking about it. So that's a really successful strategy as well.
All right, Professor.
Yeah, I mean, I think just telling them that this is their right, that, why would you not register to vote? Why would you not participate? And I think getting involved in some of these things early, in high school, doing mock elections, I think one of the best things you can do, obviously not this year necessarily because of COVID, but in normal years, if you go to the voting booth, take your kids with you. Introduce them to why this is important and how it works. So it normalizes it, makes it important, it makes it a vital part of being a responsible citizen. Right? This is both a right and a privilege in both of the strongest meanings of those words, and you need to take advantage of it.
Absolutely. I want to remind people that there's been a lot of great information today on Your Vote is Your Voice Voting in Minnesota Elections webinar. The Alumni Association and all the sponsors will make sure this session is on the Alumni Association's YouTube page by this evening. So if you didn't get some of the questions from earlier in the session, maybe you joined us late, revisit it, share it with your friends. This is such important information. So we really are up against the clock, but here's a fabulous question from Sam Rosemark to wind down on. So I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds or less. We'll start with you, Professor Lindbergh. What gives you pause and hope during these increasingly turbulent times?
What gives me pause is the threat or possibility of violence or interruption following the election, that we just won't have the patience to wait for the results to come in and be legitimate and give the winner the legitimacy that they deserve in this election. And that goes for both sides. So that's what gives me the most pause. What gives me the most hope is simply that we can come back together after this election, after this contentious cycle, heal as a nation and move forward and simply try again, try to do all of this process and keep it going, because if this process works and it was this bad, we can keep going.
Secretary.
What gives me pause is that week-long period after the election. I hope that it is not fertile ground for disinformation, misinformation, and conspiracy theories. What gives me hope is Minnesota's role in all of this. We have a great record and reputation to defend. We are #1 in the country in voter turnout. We were in 2016 and 2018. We're going for the hat trick. We're going for the three-peat. At the very least, as everyone on the U of M alumni call knows, the key thing is not being #1, it's beating Wisconsin. And I'm pretty confident that we will beat Wisconsin.
Well, great answers. What gives me pause is people are forgetting about the good book. And what's the good book? The Constitution. So I highly recommend people review the Minnesota and the United States Constitution. There are laws around elections, folks. There are 3 different branches of government, each one of them governed by specific rules. So get yourself informed. So many places you can go, including mnvotes.org. The Alumni Association and all of the sponsors today have great resources online for you. This webinar will be online by tonight. Share it and definitely stay excited about voting. What gives me hope is that there looks like there will be record turnout this year. And if there's any soapbox I have gotten on during my show these past 8 years, it is voting. I love voting. We're dedicating a segment or more every Sunday until the election on Real Talk with Roshini toward candidates as well as different voting issues. So thank you everybody for joining us today. You are an informed citizen and a great citizen just by being on this panel today. Secretary of State Steve Simon, get some rest, eat a lot of protein because you've got some big work ahead. Professor Tim Lindbergh, thank you for your insight and inspiration today. Look him up and you can follow both of these gentlemen at Prof. Timmy and at MN Secretary Sec Simon, SEC Simon, and feel free to follow me at Roshini R. Thanks for all of you for joining us. Make it a great election season.
Thanks, everybody.